Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Animas Corporation, providing insulin delivery products for people living with diabetes and part of the One Touch family. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes with the world's first continuous glucose monitoring system that sends glucose readings directly to your compatible smart device. Live life on your own terms with Dexcom. Hey, it's Stacy. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacy Sims.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Diabetes Connections. I had shared information about help for people affected by Hurricane Harvey a few weeks back, and by the time that episode aired, Irma had hit. And then, of course, we saw so much devastation in the U.S. Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico, where the rescue, can we even call it rebuilding efforts yet? Those operations and those efforts are really still going on. So my plan here was to talk to Dr. Stephen Ponder, who had been instrumental in helping with all of the efforts in Texas. But the talk that I wanted to have, which was how to be better prepared in an emergency, what we who are affected by diabetes can do to not just help people now, but to kind of help each other in the future. That was the talk I had hoped to have with Dr. Ponder, and we do discuss that. But things just kept happening, right? Disasters kept happening, storms kept hitting, and I wanted to get this out as soon as possible because they're still asking for help. So we will be linking up lots of information in the show notes, the Insulin for Life organization, the efforts to help in Puerto Rico, Dr. Ponder and T1 Team Texas, and many, many others are still trying to get help to those who need it. And just a little bit of information about Dr. Ponder. Many of you are familiar with his work. He's been on the show before, certainly talking about sugar surfing, which is maybe what he's best known for. Sugar surfing is a book and a method about dynamic glucose management, I believe he calls it. And it's a way to kind of stay ahead of the curve if you have a continuous glucose monitor. And, I'm not going to get too much into that then, but you can certainly follow Dr. Ponder and, of course, on Facebook, and I'll link up some information about sugar surfing in the show notes. Dr. Ponder also lives with type 1. He has had it for more than 50 years. When I spoke to him last year, it was on his 50th anniversary, and he has a lot to say about that. But today we're talking about emergency relief, emergency help, and he has a lot of people he wanted to thank. So that's where we got started.
I certainly want to thank the people that I partnered with in this effort, namely Ann Ember, Michelle Callison, and certainly Kelly Crumpler. We were the group that more or less came together to make a lot of the stuff here in Texas happen. I would also like to thank Melinda Rose, who many things would not be possible were it not for her influence. And quite honestly, Stacy, there are so many people that I could list off that have made all this happen. And I'm just one person of a large team of people, and I just want to make sure that's real clear. There are organizations that go beyond my locality, such as Insulin for Life, who is one of my new favorite charities. I very much support them as well over in Gainesville, Florida. Carol and Mark Atkinson's group, Direct Relief, AmeriCares, and just countless donors out there that literally have come from one corner of the country to the other to provide supplies that we were able to bring to bear for Texas and more recently now with the Caribbean. So I don't want to leave anybody out, but I know I have. But those are people that I consider very special in this effort. And then people I've just spoken to indirectly through posts and text messages and emails that have given of their time and their resources to get materials, even across the whole coast of Texas, to former colleagues of mine down in South Texas, all the way up to Beaumont, Texas, and everywhere in between. So Neil Burrell, Patsy Reyes, I can give the names would go on and on and on.
That's great. Well, then let's start by talking about the beginning of your involvement, because we saw the devastating pictures. We saw the storm and then the flooding. How did you come to be involved? And then all those names that you mentioned with Ann and Kelly, what happened?
I think this was the power of social networking and diabetes online communities. because having been here in Texas almost all of my professional life, all of the names I mentioned to you are people I have personal relationships with, either as former patients, parents of former patients, or close friends with type 1 diabetes, or former work associates. And each one of them are people I consider close friends that we still communicate with on a regular basis and maintain close connections with. And Kelly, for example, was a former patient when she was a teenager. Anne was the mom of a young man who's now an adult who I took care of. Melinda Rose, her son, Stephen, when he was a teenager 20 some odd years ago, he was my patient as well. So these were all created out of prior relationships and ongoing relationships with these individuals I've come to know and respect over the years. And Kelly and Ann were already in communication at some point when things were starting to get challenging down in the Houston area. And honestly, I think it was a message on a Facebook post or a text message I got from one of them, which led me to talk to them each individually because I knew them. And before you knew it, we had formed this consortium, very unofficial consortium, of people that were trying to connect the dots, if you will, for people in the Houston Diabetes Online community that were in dire need of diabetes supplies because of the nature of that disaster, isolating people in essentially like having moats around certain areas of the city where people couldn't get across without boats. And you saw the news reports about the Cajun Navy and all the things that people were required to do just to maneuver around the town as the storm was happening. And there were people that were frankly, had lost access to their insulin, and we had to make a case that without insulin, many of us with type 1 diabetes wouldn't last more than a couple of days. And we couldn't wait for the major institutions to step in to provide these supplies. In fact, they were still struggling just to keep their power on and stay afloat, so to speak. And we were able to fill a gap, a very short-term gap, and which ultimately resulted in the formation of this group called T1 Team Texas, which I think Ann and Kelly put together. That kind of solidified our identity in terms of how people would get in touch with us. And we developed a system around how to request supplies. Ann was very instrumental in that. Kelly was instrumental in providing a location for a lot of the supplies to accumulate. Her ex-husband is an adult endocrinologist, and she had access to supplies that way. She's also the nurse for his practice as well. So that became a receiving point, which was outside the Houston area where we couldn't transport supplies directly into because of the weather. And so it became a staging area of sorts for a few days until we could move those resources down into the Woodlands area north of Houston, where many of those supplies are at right now, slowly being distributed out. But for that week and a half, we were, and I say we, collectively, Michelle and Kelly were aggressively distributing supplies to shelters, to hospitals. We actually supplied Texas Children's Hospital for a short time with insulin through Dr. Daniel DeSalvo, who was one of the pediatric endocrinologists there. Church shelters, community shelters to George R. Brown Convention Center, some of the shelters around the Houston area, in the regional area, that were underwater, even as far down as Rockport, Texas, which was where the eye of Harvey hit the coast of Texas and was devastated. And then we also were able to connect our friends in Corpus Christi, which is about 200 miles down the coast from Houston, with supplies as well, which they in turn provided into the Corpus Christi, South Texas area. And then to the east, in Beaumont, Port Arthur area, as the flood, continued there, Dr. Neil Burrell, who's a local podiatrist who's been a friend of mine for 35 years, he took the lead there and others in that community in distributing insulin and other necessary diabetes supplies, which we in turn provided to him, in some cases via helicopter through the Department of Public Safety, again, as a result of efforts such from Melinda Rose, who was connected in the political community, and she's very well respected and known in the diabetes circles and the JDRF. And again, being a former mom of a patient of mine who's now a middle-aged adult, I mean, she was so helpful. She opened doors. Well, she knows the congressman. She knows all the people, and everybody had a role to play. I mean, no one person could ever have done this. It had to be a collective effort. And the irony of this whole experience in some ways is the people I've mentioned to you, we've never been in the same room together since this began. It's all been over the telephone, online, text messages, and so on. That's how this effort's been done. And I just think it's a truly miraculous thing that we were all able to come together for that period of time to step up and do this service. And now, of course, all the major institutions have gotten back on their feet. Things are slowly getting back to normal, even though there's still a lot of repair that needs to be done here in Texas. And my sights have more recently turned towards the Caribbean because I have family down in the Virgin Islands. My granddaughter and my daughter live down there, and now they're living with us. They escaped before the storm hit. They happen to actually be here visiting for a scheduled vacation when Irma came through, and the eye wall sat on top of St. John, Virgin Islands for 2 or 3 hours, literally devastating that island. I viewed the pictures that my daughter shared with me off her phone just the other day, and it's just staggering what's going on down there. And they're still actively recovering, having just crossed their path just a few days ago.
I want to talk about the Caribbean as well, because I know your efforts extended there. But before we go there, Dr. Ponder, had you and the other folks you mentioned in Texas, have you ever done anything like this before? Was this the first time you all kind of had to come together to this extent? Because it seemed to go really well.
I think it's because we've all worked together. Even Sonia Woolley, who's also very involved with this too. She's a mom of one of my current patients, and she's down further south than Michelle. All these individuals are people that are actively involved in diabetes and in the Houston area. I've also been involved with the Texas Diabetes Camp for the last 35, 36 years, and just about all of those individuals had connections with the camp. So I think the one thing I can say we all had in common is I knew every one of them, and either through camp or having been former patients or giving talks and doing speaking events and so on. So, and whether or not that had anything to do with it, I don't know. All I know is that these are all people I happen to know personally in one way or the other. But they also knew each other through the online community, which is very strong and healthy down in Houston, which I think was also one of the reasons this worked so well. It really was due to that socialization of families down in that area with diabetes, which has been cultivated over the last several years. And it's not just one person or group, but there's, for example, there's a Type 1 Family Network, they call it TOFN, which is very active down there. There have been a series of social networks that have been there for the last several years, but that came to be a huge asset for that community as this unique type of disaster unfolded. It wasn't a huge wind event; it was a flood, as opposed to what we saw in Florida with Irma, or even now down in the Caribbean, in these isolated islands down there, in like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico.
And then ultimately, I shouldn't say ultimately, and then as you moved forward with this, as you mentioned with the U.S. Virgin Islands, how did Richard Branson get involved? Tell us that story.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. One of my last weekend, I think it was just a week ago, it seems like, we were trying to get supplies down to donated supplies down to the Virgin Islands. And one of my residents, his name's Oscar Castro, he said in a post that I put out there asking for pilots, he said, "What about Tim Duncan?" And I thought about it for a second. I said, "No, that's not going to work." And my daughter Rachel, who was at the house at the time, said, my adult daughter, she said, she's a diabetes educator, she said, well, go ahead and do it. Let's try it, And so I said, okay, go big or go home, right? And so I put the message out there, and then one thing leads to another. Melinda Rose and a couple of other people who are well connected in the community were able to get in touch with the Tim Duncan, who's the basketball star in San Antonio, his foundation. And so that's how we got the Tim Duncan connection. And then through the Tim Duncan connection, Wendy Kowalik, who works with him, they had connections with the Branson Group. And the Branson Group was trying to get antibiotics down to Tortola in the British Virgin Islands, and they were willing to barter a little bit of freight space on one of their jets going out of San Antonio for some antibiotics that they needed for the clinic, for one of the hospitals there. So we were able to do that and provide some supplies for them. And while we never really needed their freight space because the Tim Duncan flights expedited our shipment of about 1,000 pounds of diabetes and medical supplies to the Virgin Islands, we made a good connection with them. And that's helped me connect some other people who were trying to get supplies to the Virgin Islands with pilots and airplanes and so on. So this became the ultimate telephone, social networking experience where one connection led to another, which led to another, that whole, 3 to 6 degrees of separation thing. That's really how it all worked. Yeah, somebody would mention Kenny Chesney. Kenny Chesney lives on St. John, and my son-in-law, he knows him real well. They live right around the corner from his parents, and so he's got planes that are going down there. Branson's got the British Virgin Islands, and he's trying to help them. And of course, Tim Duncan is from St. Croix, and so all of those have come together. And I've been talking to these people as recently as today, through texts and messages, coordinating the next wave of transports down next week. There will be another flight, I've been told. They're anticipating another flight down to the Virgin Islands using Tim Duncan's charters, and so we're trying to situate some supplies to get down there. It's turning more into less diabetes related, because many of the people with diabetes have found the things they need, and we were actually supplied insulin to St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas last weekend, and those items have been received. I've been in communication with the director of the Department of Health, and she's reassured me that those supplies were well used and well distributed. Even some of them were able to be distributed to the British Virgin Islands and Tortola, and that was through Stephen Prosterman, who's very well known in diabetes circles as well, who lives on St. Thomas. He's type 1, 50 years, teaches diving, and has been doing that for decades. That's how I knew Steve, as in the late 80s and 90s, he was known for being able to teach type 1 individuals how to scuba dive, and he had a huge reputation for that. And he and I were planning on actually doing a camp down there in St. John. That's not going to happen because of this storm, but we were going to have a water sports camp with sailing and scuba diving and so on. In fact, he and I met in June down in St. Thomas to do just that, to make the planning for next year, but that's going to be obviously put on hold for the foreseeable future while reconstruction takes place.
Wow. From my perspective as a parent of a child with type 1, I looked at those pictures and I listened to, your pleas and JDRF and ADA and Insulin for Life, and we need this. And what are the lessons for those of us who have diabetes in our families to be maybe better prepared, or as best prepared as you can for something like this? Did you learn anything along the way that we should know, how we can help ourselves?
I learned one thing, and it also sort of stems from my experience in 35 years of diabetes camp, is you can plan all day long. You can plan weeks, months ahead, but when events happen, you have to be very flexible. You have to realize that plans change constantly. You may be, you should be prepared, don't get me wrong, but you have to be comfortable with the fact that chaos reigns in these situations. I can't tell you how many times we had plans that would change in 30 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour and a half. Whatever we were going to do with this transport all of a sudden fell through, and we had to go to another plan B, C, D, that sort of thing. That's one thing. On a personal level, you're absolutely right. Depending on the nature of the disaster, if you know a hurricane's coming, then you have ample time to gather your supplies and depart. Now, I think what happens in a lot of cases are that people will choose to stay, and that may be despite what public officials are asking you to do, that'll nevertheless you do. If that were to happen, you need to make sure you have ample supplies and keep them in some sort of protected container or location, lest you have them compromised, and keep them on your person if necessary. But as a person with type 1 diabetes, I certainly would be, I would make sure that I had more than enough supplies to survive for at least several weeks with me, insulin, meters, carbohydrate sources, and so on. Have a bit of a survival kit, if you will. But more importantly, I would probably be one that would heed the advice of evacuating and getting out of harm's way, at least for that sort of disaster. Now, what happened down in Mexico, for example, is a totally different thing. You're talking about earthquakes, and you live on the West Coast. That's a constant fear that you guys have out there. You might be in a place where you can't get to your supplies. So that's a little bit different type of disaster than a hurricane, which gives you some degree of preparation time compared to some of these more sudden events.
What's next for T1 Teen Texas? I mean, now that you do have all this in place, are you all going to kind of put this on the back burner and think, well, maybe next time, now we all know each other, I mean, we knew each other, but, now we're all connected, we have something more official. Do you think that, there is another need that you will kind of pull this back out? Are you guys going official?
Well, Type 1 T1 Team Texas was a creation of an in-the-moment creation to give us a label, if you will, a title that people knew what we represented. And most of the people that donated knew who we were, or they were aware through other contexts that we were legitimate and so on. Now, in regards to where this goes, Kelly Crumpler is considering forming a nonprofit which can take what we collected and continue to distribute these to places like the Virgin Islands, to the Caribbean, or areas in need. Me, Michelle, and Ann personally have busy professional lives that we need to get back to. I, in particular, am a residency director as well as a busy pediatric endocrinologist. I run a children's free clinic. There are a lot of things I've got to get back to. Plus, I'm housing my granddaughter right now at our house, and she'll be with us for the foreseeable future. So when I go home, I like to switch on into grandfather mode at that point. So we have made an agreement that we are retiring, if you will, going dormant for T1 Team Diabetes, and Kelly is going to take over and create a new name, a new mission, basically supporting people with diabetes. But Ann, Michelle, and myself and Sonia are stepping down and either providing our supplies to her so she can continue the mission as she sees it, or dispersing what little we have left. And the pharmacies have opened back up. All the other sources of support are now in place in Texas. We have offered to provide some of the insulin back to Insulin for Life. Again, as I mentioned at the opening there, they have become our new best charity, so to speak. Their mission is totally in line with what I believe in. They're a small organization. They have 2 employees. They're not a big monolithic group. It's run by Carol and Mark Atkinson, and it's been around for about 5 years, modeled after the international Insulin for Life group that's been around, I think, in Australia for 20 years. But they are international, the U.S. model, and I strongly encourage people to support Insulin for Life because it's aptly named. They are getting insulin to people to help them survive, literally live, and that's what we set out to do, and we did. And I do feel very proud to have been part of this group because I know firsthand there are people that got insulin either hand delivered. Some of the volunteers hand delivered through wading through water to get insulin to people in their homes in the south part of Houston, which just kind of brought tears to my eyes that you had volunteers with that much dedication to get supplies to people in need when they needed it, and that's when all the other systems were paralyzed by the storm. That, I think, was the finest hour, if you will, of this consortium of volunteers. And that's what we are, a consortium of volunteers that all had different skill sets, different backgrounds, but we were all brought together by one common belief in not letting anybody with diabetes go without their needs met. And we know that because many of us live with this type 1 every day, like myself. Everyone there is touched in some fashion by type 1 diabetes as a patient or as a parent of somebody with diabetes.
I don't even know how to ask this, but I'm going to try anyway. When you hear about a situation like that, a volunteer is wading through the water, trying to get to people, as you mentioned earlier, that are in these kind of these islands that are isolated, and they need the insulin, and you hear them that they got insulin, they got test strips, they got what they needed to make it through this. Did you allow yourself even a moment to think about that? I mean, it is very emotional. I got a pit in my stomach when you started talking about that.
Yes, that one got to me. I can talk about it more forthright right now. But when I heard that story, that one of the volunteers literally was going to homes that didn't have social media outlets, didn't have any sort of Facebook or any way to get things out, but they knew that there were people that needed insulin, and to hear they were going door to door doing that, it tugs at your heart, and it just speaks to the tremendous amount of volunteerism, passion that people have for each other that you saw. You saw that in news reports, and it really does exist. Neighbors helping neighbors, and that's how they got through all this, was people stepping out to help each other. It just so happened it was in the diabetes community, but it was also happening in every other strata of life in that city, not just diabetes. And I dare say there are probably many other disease conditions where they were connected in a similar fashion, where somebody down the street knew they needed an asthma inhaler, for example, and they had 2 or 3 extras, and they knew a child down there had lost his or hers in the flood. And I'm sure that same thing happened for those sorts of conditions. I just happen to be tuned into the frequency of type 1 diabetes here, and I know for a fact that these sorts of events occurred routinely, and we were able to facilitate that because we could connect the dots better. We knew that somebody 25 miles away in one part of Houston had something that somebody 25 miles away needed, and we could find ways to connect those dots or provide temporary supplies to the person because they were isolated by water until we could get a replacement back to the other location. All that fit into place. And again, it's because you have such a passionate group of people in that area who believed in each other and knew each other and selflessly gave of their time and their own, as we all know, very expensive insulin and other supplies to others. And I couldn't be more proud to have been affiliated with a group of people like that. And as I said, I've never seen most of these people that are doing these volunteer efforts, I've never seen face-to-face. I've heard their names. I may have gotten a quick post from them, but we've never been in the same room together during this entire experience. I've been totally up here in Central Texas when they've all been down on the coast or down, like I said before, in the Caribbean, working the phones here. So, but that's the nature of our lives now. We have the ability to communicate, and that was not interrupted. Now, I'm finding significant problems communicating with the Caribbean because of just the nature of the location and the fact that phone coverage has been interrupted. We have my son-in-law has a satellite phone, but we have limited ability to communicate with him down there now. But Houston was a little bit different. So back to your question about what did you learn, one additional thing we learned is that every disaster has its own unique set of circumstances. As I alluded to before, Houston was turned into a series of islands through all this rain. The Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico have lost power completely, and they've had their whole infrastructure wiped away. We didn't have that here in Texas, that we could still communicate with people. We just couldn't get to them very easily, yet that still didn't subtract from the need to get insulin very quickly. And through helicopters and through boats and through, like I said, wading through waist-deep water, we were able to meet those needs. So I would dare say the next disaster like this will be similarly unique in many ways, but it will require, what it requires is a group of people that are willing to set aside their personal needs for the needs of others. And if that happens, it doesn't matter what type of morphology the disaster has, we will be successful. That's what I would learn. And people will put aside those differences and do what's best for each other. And I'm seeing that already in the Virgin Islands already because I have a lot of contact with people. I've had several calls today of what's going on down there. People going over and above, bending over backwards to gather, collect supplies, get them down there as quickly as possible. And I just got off the phone with my daughter who just informed me that the clinic in St. John is now fully stocked with supplies. Now, the question, of course, is how long will they be good for? And will they need to be replenished at some point? But I think now that the storm has passed, all the major agencies are starting to come back in, but there's just so much infrastructure that's been damaged that needs to be repaired down there. Same applies to some extent for Houston, although it's a lot of individual home damages. But the water subsided, people can maneuver now, people are back to work, and so Team Texas is going into hibernation for a while. Kelly's going to carry on, I think, in some fashion with a new title but a similar mission. And I wish her well for that. But Ann, Michelle, and myself and Sonia are going to need to back off and go on our individual ways for now.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask, if people listening may be aware, maybe not, that you, as you said, you live with type 1 diabetes. You are living with it now for more than 51 years, right? How are you? How are you doing?
Well, I've had type 1 for 51 years. It'll be 52 next March 1st. I've been fortunate enough to have great parents, and I was enrolled in the Joslin medalist group last year. And one thing I like to share with families, as recently as yesterday, I tell this to the families, I tell it to my parents at camp, that, when I got enrolled in the Joslin Medalist Group, they have a secret Facebook page they let all the members join. There's several hundred members there, and when I do the math, it's like 40,000 years of patient experience. About a year and a half ago, somebody posted a query to the group saying, we all come from different backgrounds, we are different genders, different ethnicities, different cultures, we live in different places on the planet. Why do we all have this similarity that we've all lived 50 years? I mean, we're genetically different in every way, shape, and form. We have different environmental exposures. What's the one thing we have in common that have allowed us to live 50 years? And there was an immediate post out, which everybody then unanimously said this is the reason, and that was we had good families. We had good families. And I tell that to parents all the time who fret about whether they have enough technology or whatever, or devices and so on, or the right meds or the right insulin or whatever. I grew up through an era you would consider the Dark Ages, where those things didn't exist. We just had basic animal insulin and glass syringes and metal needles you reused, yet we're still here 50 years later, and I'm fairly complication-free, very, nothing major. And it wasn't because of the devices. It wasn't. Yes, up to a point it was. I had to have the insulin. We had to have ways to deliver it. But what it came down to was having good parents. And I'm adopted, so you can't say it's genetic either. And I tell parents that because a lot of times we get so caught up with the technology side of our diabetes that we have to have a better device or a newer device to manage it. No, we don't. We need to have the right attitudes. We need to make the best decisions we can make. We need to learn from the mistakes we make and make better decisions the next time. Diabetes control is all about your choices, and you make hundreds of choices every day. Make the best you can, and don't beat yourself up when you make something that doesn't work out for you. There's no guilt. There should be no guilt in the management of this disease. There should be no judgment in the management of this disease, and that's how I practice it. That's how I live it, and I think that's an important message for people to remember. And that's coming from somebody who's had it for 50 years, and quite frankly, hundreds of others who agree with me on this as well. That it comes down to having a good family who takes the time and effort to deal with diabetes on a daily basis with you, rather than having you deal with it all on your own.
Well, it is not often that I get emotional on this show, Dr. Ponder, but that sentiment really has that means a lot to me. Thank you very much for sharing that, as I know you do with many parents, because I think we cannot hear that enough. It can seem very scary out there. So thank you very much for bringing that point home. I appreciate it. It has been just a privilege to talk to you, and anytime you want this microphone, it is yours to thank your team or anyone else, because sitting here high and dry as we were in North Carolina, just getting a little bit of remnants of the storm, it was incredible to watch your team and so many others jump in to help. So, just to have a little bit of time to acknowledge those folks and to give you the chance to talk about it. I cannot thank you enough. It's such a privilege to do that. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Stacey. It's an honor to be here with you today. Thank you.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I have to tell you, I cut off the recording, but those remarks by Dr. Ponder about staying complication-free and the key to it, having caring parents, it really, you could probably hear it. It brought me to tears. And in fact, my studio is in, we have a little bonus room off our master bedroom, and my husband was watching TV in the next room, and you usually can't hear anything. Soundproofing is pretty good in here. But he heard me yell, "You made me cry," to Dr. Ponder, and he wanted to know what that was all about. So yeah, he definitely brought me to tears, and I'm so glad that he took the time to say that at the end. I think we do need to hear that it's really just about caring. And not to get too cliche, but this episode is about caring for each other. Hopefully, as he said, there are communities taking care of each other. There are different health communities who have the means and the supplies to help those with other chronic conditions and emergency conditions. But we have the means to help each other with diabetes, with insulin and getting it where it needs to go. So as I release this episode, I'm sure we're not out of the woods yet. So I will be linking up at diabetes-connections.com and in the show notes ways to help, ways to donate, and things you can do today to help each other tomorrow and for the future. A huge thank you to Dr. Ponder and everyone he mentioned, my goodness, there were so many people who've helped out, who took the time. And I know many of you did as well. You packaged diabetes supplies. You made monetary donations to Insulin for Life. You did what needed to be done to save lives and help each other. So thank you so much for that. All right, back to our regular schedule next week. Speaking of helping each other, we're going to be talking to Weston Nordgren. He is with the Night Scout Foundation and a big member of CGM in the Cloud, very active. And he'll be sharing his family's story, which is an unusual one, and also sharing how the CGM in the Cloud Facebook group, which if you're not familiar with, I believe is now the largest Facebook group of people with type 1 diabetes on Facebook group on Facebook, but you know what I mean. And in fact, Facebook invited them to an international conference that was very select. And we're going to talk to Wes about what happened there, what's going on with the group, and how he's doing. It's a very interesting story. Wes has grown children, he and his wife Colleen, and they adopted 3 young children with special needs, one of whom then developed type 1. So a lot more to come, and that is next week. In the meantime, thank you for joining me for this special bonus episode of Diabetes Connections. It's always great to spend a little extra time with people who get it. I'm Stacey Sims, and I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.